Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now I'm going to keep this relatively brief because there are a lot of details I could go into talking about 20th century Japanese swords, which I'm not going to go into a full detailed video here. Maybe that can be for the future. But as I am an antique dealer as well as a YouTuber, sometimes things just come across my dealing table that I feel I have to quickly do a video about. And this is one of those cases. Now what I'm holding here is called a Kyu Gunto, which is a form of Japanese military sword used during the Meiji period, particularly in the 1870s, mid-1870s, 1875-ish, all the way through until shortly before the Second World War, so the mid-1930s, 1934 to be precise. And as you will notice, it is a saber. Now, a lot of you would not necessarily think of this, if you saw it immediately, as a Japanese sword, but I can assure you it is a Japanese sword. The scabbard's fairly boring, so I won't say very much about that. But if we just have a little look at the sword, if we focus on the blade for a second, you'll notice that the tip is very much shaped like a typical Japanese sword, and it does have an etched, I don't know if you'll be able to see on camera, yes you can just about, I think, it has got an etched hamon on it. Now that hamon is completely fake. This is a machine produced modern steel blade. It's not made traditionally according to the Japanese style of making blades from tamahagane and all that kind of stuff. It's not edge quenched, it is through tempered, oil quenched and tempered spring steel with an etched hamon on. So it is fulfilling some of the Japanese sensibilities of what a sword should look like, whilst mechanically being essentially a modern Western sword in that sense, from that point of view. And we also notice a minor detail, it's got a ricasso as well, again, something we don't generally find on Japanese swords at all. So despite the fact that it's got a hamon, a cosmetic hamon, shall we call it that, and it has a kisaki that is shaped, or point that is shaped like a typical Japanese sword, it has a hilt that is very much shaped like a European sword and is modelled specifically. Some of you might think, oh, it's modelled on a US model 1850 field officer's sword. Technically, no, it's modelled on a French sword. Now, any of you who've seen The Last Samurai might be under the impression that the American military had a great impact on the Japanese military. Now, they had some, so did the British and other people. In fact, the British military were actually working with the Japanese to some extent from an observer status during the Japanese-Russian War of 1904 to 1906. There's reports from British officers who were sent out there to observe the war and report back. And in fact, some of their observations fed into planning and strategies for World War I. And it's one of the reasons that bayonet charges were so beloved of the British, although we had a tradition of them in Britain. But the Japanese had used the bayonet so effectively during the Russian-Japanese War that it was thought that that was the way that things were going to go. So now what's interesting is this style of sword. Now I actually have some French swords here and I'm going to show you. So let's have a close-up look at the hilt. I've got a label on this because this is part of my stock. But you will, if you just look at that hilt, if you look at the shape of the guard and the grip is made of horn, and obviously you can see it's got wire wrap, it's got a back strap, it has a mon there which relates to a particular clan. But if you look at the style of the guard and the pommel in particular, now what we're going to do is we're going to move over to a French 1845 model sword, also has a label because it's also in stock, and you will notice that it very clearly, this is the inspiration for the Japanese sword. Now, a curiosity of the Kyu Gunto, and this doesn't go for all of them, but it certainly goes for a lot of them, is they are quite diminutive. So they are slightly scaled down versions of the French swords. They're not particularly shorter. Funnily enough, the blade's actually slightly longer than the French one, but the guard is just a little bit smaller and the grip's a little bit smaller. So they're kind of scaled down. Now, without going into too much more detail, you will also be aware that there are other versions of the Kyu Gunto, that some of them have two-handed length grips on them, so you can grip them like a katana or tachi, but they still have the saber guard on them. So that's the first thing. A lot of people are surprised to find out that in Japan, in the Japanese military, after the suppression of the samurai, which happened in the 1860s, and from the middle of the 1870s onwards, Japan was all about westernization, industrialization. It was building battleships, the sort of pre-dreadnoughts, ironclads. It was the uniforms that they had were modelled on mostly on the French uniforms, a little bit of influence from perhaps from Prussia and America and elsewhere as well. And indeed, therefore, the swords they started carrying were modelled on European swords as well. And obviously they had modern firearms by that point. So they had completely westernized. But things changed in Japan. So Japan went through the Sino-Japanese War in the mid-1890s. Then it had the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 to 1906. So it had lots of conflict with neighbours, essentially, as it expanded and industrialised and became quite aggressive in the region. Started coming into conflict with other major powers at that time into the pre-World War I era. But what was interesting is there were a lot of changes in Japan, particularly after the First World War era. And what we start to see is a lot more looking back to the old times and trying to bring back some feeling of Japaneseness again. So in the build-up to World War II in the 1930s, when again Japan was being very expansionist and imperial, particularly in China and elsewhere, it was sort of looking back to previous days of glory of Japan, and so they decided in 1934 to do away with the Western Kyu Gunto. Okay, so officially on paper, and certainly if you read in lots of books or websites and stuff, they will say in 1934 the Kyu Gunto, the Japanese sabre, and there were incidentally other types of Japanese sabre, other forms of Kyu Gunto, and there was a cavalry sword as well, which is quite a nice sword. These were officially done away with in 1934, at least on paper. But the one thing that you often won't read mentioned is actually these did continue in circulation. First of all, you've got Japanese officers who were already carrying these things, and in some cases there would have been an overlap period where they would have carried on carrying them. But in addition, once we get into the early part of World War II and Japan's sort of war of aggression, there was a shortage of the new type of sword which had come in, which we're going to look at in a second. And so the Kyu Guntos, to fill a gap essentially, initially probably for shortage of swords, probably were still in service. So in World War II, probably there were some Kyu Guntos still in service, even though they weren't officially still a service sword. So what was the service sword? Well, I mentioned that they had been quite patriotic and looking back to previous generations. And so essentially they introduced this sword, which many people would look at and say, it's a katana. Well, actually, technically, it's more like a tachi. It's like a short tachi, okay? So the hilt mounts, and what is it called? We call it a Shin Gunto, okay? Now, it can go by other names, for example, Showato, which basically means a sword from the Showa era, which is basically modern. But most people in the sort of military world and sword collecting world would call this a Shin Gunto. Now, Shin Gunto is clearly modelled on an old sword, and what it was modelled on specifically, or inspired by, shall we say, if rather than modelled on, it was inspired by the tachi of the Kamakura period. So what the patriotic Japanese and imperialistic Japanese in this period were doing was looking back to a period where they considered that an era of past glory for Japan as a nation, where they thought, okay, we'll model our new sword on something from that time as a patriotic thing. So this, in a sense, was moving away from the European idea of a sword and moving back to what they saw as the traditional Japanese idea of a sword. Now, there are some differences. The scabbards were, for the most part, made of steel. This one's actually wood, which could be for various reasons. Some were wood covered with steel, they were steel with a wooden core. Some were wood painted to look like steel, and there are variations. There are various different models. There's the Type 94, the Type 95, which is an NCO sword. The 94 is an officer sword, and then there's a Type 98. I would, based on my knowledge, call this a Type 98. And this, the Nagasa or tang is signed by a smith, although this was arsenal made, probably from modern steel, probably oil quenched. And based on the smith's name, this probably dates to about the middle of the Second World War, so about 1941 to 43, something like that. It's not a late war example, it's not an early war example, it's kind of mid-war example. So let's dispense with the scabbard for a second, which is in not great condition, I have to say. That leather's detached up there, so it's one of the reasons to get rid of that for the time being. But you can see that fundamentally it looks kind of like a katana, doesn't it, or a short tachi. Now in terms of length, this is pretty damn short. This is only a 60 centimeter blade, which is the minimum length for something to officially be called a katana. Below that, you'd call it a wakizashi, or well, if it was as much as say 59 centimeters, you might call it an o-wakizashi, a big wakizashi. Usually wakizashis are nearer kind of 50 to 52 centimeters blade length, sometimes under 50 centimeters. This is 60 centimeters, so it's just on the cusp of a short katana. Now, it is short. It is a short sword, okay, so absolutely you could use this easily as a one-handed sword, but it's got a long grip, so you could use it as a really short two-handed sword as well. You have to bear in mind in this era, although officers had to wear swords, they didn't necessarily use them very much for combat, although they did probably lead their troops with them and occasionally use them in combat, even in the Second World War. So this was primarily a badge of office to lead men with, and you didn't necessarily want a whopping great blade. Not to say you don't get some with big blades, you do get some Shin Gunto with whopping great sort of 32, 33 inch blades on them occasionally, but most of them are like this and short, okay, so most of them are kind of 25, 26, 27 inches and not very often above about 27, 28 inch blades. So for a two-handed sword, they are pretty damn short, but bear in mind this is the age of bolt action rifles, submachine guns, semi-automatic pistols and revolvers, and this is World War II. There are lots of machine guns around and all this kind of stuff. So basically if you're charging into a trench with a hand weapon, even if you intend to use it as a weapon, you might be better off actually with a short blade than a long sword, because for the most part you're not going to be fighting another person who's got a sword. You're going to be jumping into a trench and trying to take people out who've maybe got trench knives or trench clubs or bayonets on the end of rifles, this kind of stuff. Okay, so it's a very different environment to the Kamakura period when the tachi was being used, when a lot of those have got 30-inch blades or even longer. Okay, so it's essentially a mini tachi. It's technically, in terms of length, it's a short katana, but in terms of the hilt style and the way that the scabbard is worn, so it's worn edge down. Actually, in reality, they only have one hanging ring, so they tend to hang more vertically when an officer's wearing them, but the rings are attached at the back. So because the rings are attached at the back, therefore in theory it would hang edge down, which makes it a tachi, and also the style of the hilt with this particular type of kashira at the end here, kabuto kashira I think it's called, or something like that. But anyway, this particular style is a tachi style one, and this particular style of guard associated with the tachi, so it's very much modelled after a tachi. So there we go, without waffling on anymore. Obviously this is not my specialist subject, but I am learning more about these as I go along, and they're actually very interesting things, and it's always interesting to learn something new. So Japanese swords of the 20th century are kind of a new thing for me. So there we go, we went from essentially the katana in the 19th century to, in the 1870s and onwards, we went to the Kyu Gunto, and then in the mid 1930s we went back to the Shin Gunto, which was sort of inspired by much earlier Japanese swords, and these are the swords that are famously carried by officers particularly, but also there's an NCO's version during World War II in the jungles of Burma and China and elsewhere. So there we go. I hope that's been somewhat interesting. For those of you who don't know about this topic, hopefully that will be a little bit of a primer. Thanks for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be so. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.